Some men are forged by love. Others are forged by the complete absence of it. And a rare, dangerous few are forged by the moment they realize the thing they destroyed was the only thing keeping them alive. Before this story ends, the most powerful duke in the kingdom will kneel in the snow before a woman he spent 3 years treating like furniture, and he will beg. Not for forgiveness, for survival. Whether she grants it depends on how much ruin a heart can remember before it decides remembering is no longer worth the cost. Stay until the end. You will want to see how this breaks. The wedding was a funeral dressed in white silk. Everyone in the cathedral knew it. The 600 guests arranged across mahogany pews in the Church of St. Albans did not witness a union. They witnessed an inventory transfer. The Duke of Ravenshire was acquiring a replacement, and the replacement stood at the altar with hands trembling inside ivory gloves, watching the man she was about to marry stare through her like she was nothing more than architecture. Caedric Ravenshire did not smile. He did not extend his hand. When the officiant pronounced them bound, he offered Seraphina Vale the smallest possible nod, the kind a man gives a servant who has placed his breakfast correctly, and turned toward the doors without waiting for her. The guests did not gasp. They had expected exactly this. Seraphina walked 3 steps behind him down the aisle, her veil catching on the edge of a pew, and no one moved to help her free it. She tugged it loose herself, and the tiny ripping sound echoed louder than the organ music. Outside, rain hammered the cobblestones as if the sky itself wanted to wash the entire charade away. Caedric climbed into the carriage first. Seraphina climbed in after him. They sat across from each other in silence for 17 miles through mud-slicked countryside roads, and he never once looked at her face. She studied his instead. He was not handsome in the way poets described handsome men. His jaw was too angular, cut like something carved with a blade rather than shaped by gentle hands. His eyes were the color of wet slate, and they carried a permanent quality of assessment, as though every person who entered his vision was being weighed against a scale only he could see. His dark hair was pulled back severely, exposing a forehead lined with tension far older than his 31 years. He looked like a man who had been clenching his teeth since childhood and had simply forgotten how to stop. Seraphina opened her mouth twice during the ride. Both times, the words dissolved before reaching sound. She had rehearsed sentences in the mirror for weeks. Charming introductions. Warm observations about the countryside. Questions about his preferences, his routines, his expectations. All of it evaporated inside the carriage's suffocating silence. When they arrived at Ravenshire Castle, Caedric stepped out first and spoke to his steward without acknowledging her existence. "Mrs. Hale will show the Duchess to her quarters. See that she has everything she requires." He walked away before Seraphina's feet touched the gravel. Mrs. Hale, a stout woman in her 50s with the practiced warmth of someone who had survived decades inside this household by making herself indispensable, appeared beside the carriage with a lantern. "Your Grace," she said gently, "follow me." Seraphina followed. She followed through enormous doors into a grand hall where portraits of dead Ravenshire men stared down from gilded frames with identical expressions of cold superiority. She followed up a sweeping staircase where the stone walls seemed to breathe winter air even in late spring. She followed down a corridor so long and so dark that the lantern light could not reach both walls at the same time. Her chambers were beautiful, suffocatingly beautiful. Silk curtains the color of midnight blue framed windows overlooking the estate's northern grounds. A 4-poster bed dominated the center of the room, draped in embroidered linen that probably cost more than her father's annual income from the Vale tenant farms. A writing desk. A vanity mirror framed in silver. A fireplace already burning low. Everything a duchess could want. Except company. "His Grace retires to the East Wing," Mrs. Hale said carefully. "Separate chambers have been the tradition at Ravenshire for several generations." Seraphina looked at the older woman and understood immediately that this was not tradition. This was architecture designed to enforce distance. "Of course," Seraphina said. Mrs. Hale hesitated at the door. Something flickered behind her professional composure. Pity, maybe, or warning. "If you need anything at all, Your Grace, ring the bell beside the mantel. Someone will come." Then the door closed and Seraphina stood alone inside the most expensive cage in the kingdom. She did not cry. She had spent the last 4 months crying, and somewhere between her sister's death and this morning's ceremony, the tears had simply stopped coming. What replaced them was something harder, something quieter. A stillness inside her chest that felt less like peace and more like the silence after an explosion, when the ringing in your ears is so loud you mistake it for calm. Arabella would have conquered this castle in a single evening. Arabella would have swept through these corridors with her golden hair catching lamplight and her laughter filling every cold corner until the stones themselves seemed warmer. Arabella had been the one promised to Caedric Ravenshire, the brilliant match that would unite two of the kingdom's oldest houses in a partnership everyone called inevitable. Then a carriage accident on the Canterbury Road took Arabella's life, and inevitability shattered overnight. Seraphina was not the backup plan. She was the emergency compromise. The younger sister no one had particularly noticed, offered to the Duke like a consolation gift wrapped in obligation. She sat on the edge of the enormous bed and stared at the fire. She was 22 years old. She was married to a man who had not spoken a single personal word to her. And somewhere beneath the numbness, in a place she could not quite reach yet, a question was forming that would take years to fully articulate. What happens to a person who is never seen? The answer, she would eventually discover, is that they either disappear entirely or they become someone impossible to ignore. But that night, Seraphina Vale simply went to sleep inside a stranger's castle and dreamed of nothing. The first month taught her the architecture of neglect. Caedric Ravenshire operated on a schedule so rigid it resembled military discipline. He rose at 5. He rode the estate grounds until 7. He took breakfast alone in his study while reviewing correspondence and land management reports. He met with his steward, his solicitor, or visiting dignitaries throughout the morning and afternoon. He dined alone at precisely 8 in the evening. He retired to his private chambers by 10. Seraphina existed nowhere inside this schedule. She ate breakfast in the smaller dining room, served by footmen who addressed her with rigid courtesy and volunteered nothing beyond, "Yes, Your Grace," and "Of course, Your Grace." She walked the gardens alone. She explored the library alone. She sat in the drawing room alone while rain streaked down the windows, and the enormous grandfather clock in the hallway marked hours that felt like geological ages. Twice during the first week, she encountered Caedric in the corridors. Both times, he acknowledged her with a nod so brief it could have been mistaken for a muscle twitch. Both times, he continued walking without slowing. On the 9th day, she decided to force the matter. She found him in his study after dinner, standing behind a massive oak desk covered in documents and maps. The firelight painted half his face in warm tones and left the other half in shadow, which struck her as accidentally honest. "May I come in?" she asked from the doorway. He did not look up. "You may." She entered and stood across the desk from him. The distance between them felt deliberate, as though the desk itself was a barricade he had positioned for exactly this purpose. "I thought perhaps we should discuss the household arrangements," she said. "I would like to understand my responsibilities as Duchess. Mrs. Hale manages the household. I understand that, but surely there are duties expected of me beyond simply occupying a bedroom." Caedric finally looked up. His slate-gray eyes moved across her face with the same clinical detachment a physician might use while examining a patient he found medically uninteresting. "You are the Duchess of Ravenshire," he said flatly. "Your duty is to represent this house at social functions when required, and to conduct yourself in a manner consistent with the family's reputation. Beyond that, your time is your own." "And what about us?" she asked quietly. The word hung between them like a lit match in a dark room. "Us," he repeated, as though the concept was foreign vocabulary. "We are married, Caedric. We share a name, we share a house. At some point, we will need to share a conversation longer than 30 seconds. Something shifted behind his expression. Not warmth, something more like calculation, the rapid reassessment of a variable he had not expected to become relevant. "You were given to me as part of an arrangement between our families," he said. "I honored that arrangement. I will continue to honor it. You will have everything you need here: comfort, security, freedom to pursue whatever occupies your interest. But do not confuse proximity with intimacy, Your Grace. This marriage is a contract. I fulfilled my half. I expect you to fulfill yours." The brutality of it was not in his words. It was in the total absence of cruelty in his voice. He was not trying to wound her. He genuinely did not believe she was owed anything beyond what he had listed. Seraphina stood very still for a long moment. "What exactly is my half?" she asked. "Discretion," he said. "Composure, and the understanding that I married your family's name, not you." He returned his attention to the documents on his desk. Seraphina left the study without another word. She walked the entire length of the eastern corridor, descended the servants' staircase, crossed the darkened kitchen, and stepped outside into the freezing November night, where she stood on the flagstones behind the castle and breathed until the shaking in her hands stopped. She did not cry. She decided. The decision was not dramatic. It did not arrive with theatrical music or a sudden blaze of determination lighting up her eyes. It arrived quietly, the way truly dangerous things always do, in the gap between one breath and the next, in the silence after being told you are worthless by a man who does not even consider the statement cruel. She would not beg for his attention. She would not perform for his approval. She would not shrink herself to fit inside the tiny box he had built for her. She would build her own kingdom inside his. The transformation did not happen overnight. It happened the way rivers carve through stone, slowly, relentlessly, and by the time anyone noticed the landscape had changed, it was already too late to reverse. It started with the tenant villages. Seraphina had overheard Mrs. Hale mention that the northern settlements were struggling after a failed harvest. Crop rot had destroyed most of the barley stores, and 3 families had already abandoned their farms. The steward had submitted a report to Caedric recommending increased rents on the remaining tenants to compensate for the revenue loss. Seraphina read the report. Then she rode to the villages herself. What she found was worse than failed crops. She found children eating boiled nettles because there was nothing else. She found a woman named Martha Gowan nursing an infant with a fever while her husband lay in the next room with a broken leg that had healed crooked because no surgeon had come. She found roofs collapsing, wells contaminated, and a schoolhouse that had been shuttered for 2 years because the estate could not justify the expense of a teacher when profits were declining. Seraphina returned to the castle and walked directly into the steward's office without knocking. "Your recommendation to raise rents on the northern tenants," she said. "Withdraw it." Thomas Blackwood, Ravenshire's steward for 15 years, looked at her with the polite condescension of a man who had never taken an order from a woman and saw no reason to start. "With respect, Your Grace, estate finances are managed under the Duke's authority. The Duke has not visited those villages in over a year. I visited them this morning. 3 families are starving. A man is crippled because no one sent a surgeon. Children are eating weeds. Raising rents on people who cannot feed themselves is not financial management. It is slow execution." Blackwood stiffened. "I will raise your concerns with His Grace. You will do more than that. You will release emergency grain stores from the southern barns to the northern settlements by tomorrow morning. You will send Dr. Phelps to examine Thomas Gowan's leg, and you will reopen the village school before the end of the month. Your Grace, I cannot authorize expenditures of that nature without the Duke's direct approval." "Then tell the Duke his wife authorized them." Seraphina held Blackwood's gaze until he looked away. It took 11 seconds. She counted. When Blackwood brought the matter to Caedric that evening, Seraphina was not present for the conversation, but Mrs. Hale was, and Mrs. Hale told a kitchen maid, and the kitchen maid told the stable master, and by morning the entire household knew what the Duke had said. "Let her do what she wants. It changes nothing." He meant it as dismissal, as proof that her actions were too insignificant to warrant his opposition. He did not realize he had just handed her the keys to his kingdom. Seraphina used those keys with surgical precision. Within 3 months, she had restructured the northern tenant agreements, replacing the punitive rent increases with a profit-sharing arrangement that incentivized crop diversification. She negotiated directly with wool merchants in the neighboring county, securing contracts that tripled the income from Ravenshire sheep farms. She hired a traveling surgeon to visit the tenant villages twice monthly. She reopened the schoolhouse and recruited a teacher from the Ashford Academy by offering a salary the Duke's steward would have considered obscene. None of it was charity. Every decision was calculated to strengthen the estate's economic foundation while improving the lives of the people who actually generated its wealth. The servants noticed first. Gradually, imperceptibly, the way household staff always notice shifts in power before anyone else, they began directing certain questions to the Duchess instead of the steward. Small things initially. menu selections, linen orders, staff scheduling, then larger things, vendor disputes, maintenance priorities, guest accommodations. Mrs. Hale, who had survived 4 decades at Ravenshire by reading power dynamics the way sailors read weather, adjusted her loyalty accordingly. She began briefing Seraphina on household matters every morning at 7, a full hour before Blackwood arrived at the estate office. By the end of the first year, the castle operated on 2 parallel systems of authority. Caedric controlled the political exterior, the parliamentary alliances, the noble negotiations, the public machinery of aristocratic power. Seraphina controlled the interior, the daily reality of how Ravenshire actually functioned, from the grain in the barns to the wages in the ledgers to the morale of every person who lived and worked within the estate's borders. They rarely spoke. When they did, it was the clipped transactional language of 2 executives managing adjacent departments in a corporation neither of them had chosen to run. "The Hensworth delegation arrives Tuesday," he would say. "I will arrange the guest wing. Lord Ashton requires a response regarding the trade summit. I drafted a letter this morning. It is on your desk." Professional, efficient, completely devoid of anything resembling human connection. Seraphina told herself this was enough. She told herself that purpose was a perfectly adequate substitute for love, that building something meaningful from the wreckage of a loveless marriage was its own form of victory. Most nights, she believed it. Some nights, she stood at her window watching the lamplight in Caedric's study across the courtyard and wondered what it would have been like if he had looked at her on their wedding day the way a man looks at someone he has chosen rather than someone he has settled for. Those nights were the worst. She buried them like a surgeon burying casualties, with efficiency and without ceremony, because survival demanded forward motion and grief was a luxury she could not afford. 2 years and 3 months into the marriage, everything shifted. It began with a letter delivered to Ravenshire Castle on a frost-bitten February morning, sealed with the crimson wax crest of the Mortimer family. Lord Adrian Mortimer requested permission to visit the estate as part of a regional agricultural survey commissioned by the Ministry of Lands. The letter was addressed to the Duke, but the actual business, evaluating the innovative tenant farming arrangements that had made Ravenshire the most productive estate in the northern counties, was entirely Seraphina's domain. Caedric approved the visit without reading the letter twice. Another delegation, another political courtesy, another item on a schedule already compressed beyond human tolerance. He did not know who Adrian Mortimer was. He did not know that Adrian had once courted Arabella Vale before her engagement to Ravenshire was announced. And he did not know that the man arriving at his castle in 3 days carried a warmth so effortless and so genuine that it would illuminate every frozen corner of the life Caedric had built, exposing the vast, unbearable emptiness he had spent 31 years pretending did not exist. Adrian Mortimer rode through the castle gates on a gray mare at 11 in the morning, and by noon Seraphina Vale was laughing for the first time in 2 years. The sound traveled through the great hall like something foreign, something the stones did not recognize. A footman nearly dropped a silver tray. Mrs. Hale paused mid-sentence in the corridor and pressed her hand against the wall as if the floor had shifted beneath her feet. Adrian was 33, tall, but not imposingly so. His features were open and unremarkable in the way that genuinely kind faces often are. Pleasant enough that you trusted them immediately, forgettable enough that you could not quite reconstruct them afterward. His hair was the color of autumn wheat, and he pushed it away from his forehead constantly while talking, a gesture so habitual it had become part of his punctuation. He arrived with 2 assistants, a leather satchel full of agricultural surveys, and the kind of conversational energy that made everyone around him feel slightly more intelligent than they actually were. "Your Grace," he said, bowing to Seraphina with a warmth that managed to be both formal and genuine simultaneously. "The reports about your tenant reforms have reached London. Frankly, they have embarrassed several members of the ministry who have been arguing for years that profit-sharing arrangements are economically impossible." "They are economically impossible," Seraphina said, "if your only goal is extracting maximum revenue from people who have no leverage. If your goal is building a sustainable estate that functions like a community rather than a mining operation, the math works perfectly." Adrian stared at her for a moment, then laughed. "I've been trying to make that exact argument in committee rooms for 2 years, and you just said it better in 15 seconds. Committee rooms are designed to suffocate good ideas, Seraphina said. That is their primary function. Adrian laughed again, and this time Seraphina smiled back, and something that had been locked behind iron discipline for 27 months cracked open just slightly, just enough to let light in. Over the following days, Adrian toured the tenant villages with Seraphina as his guide. She showed him the restructured farms, the reopened schoolhouse, the medical rotation system. She introduced him to Martha Gowan, whose husband was now walking again after a second surgery Seraphina had arranged. She walked him through the financial ledgers that proved every investment in human welfare had returned measurable economic value within 18 months. Adrian asked questions no one had ever asked her, not about the numbers, though he understood those perfectly, but about the philosophy behind them. "Why do you care?" he asked one afternoon while they walked a frozen path between two barley fields. "You are a duchess. You could spend your days in ballrooms and drawing rooms, and no one would fault you for it. The people in those villages are not abstractions on a balance sheet," Seraphina said. "They are human beings with names and children and broken bodies. Someone has to see them as that." "And the Duke? Does he see them that way?" Seraphina was quiet for a long moment. "The Duke sees what he chooses to see," she said finally, "and he has chosen not to see very much." Adrian did not press further, but his eyes stayed on her face with an expression that was neither pity nor attraction. It was recognition, the startled awareness of someone encountering a mind operating at a frequency he had almost stopped believing existed. Caedric Ravenshire first noticed Adrian Mortimer on the fourth evening of the visit. He was descending the grand staircase for dinner when he heard voices from the library below. He paused midway down the steps, one hand on the banister, and looked through the open doors. Seraphina stood beside the great table covered in estate maps, pointing to something in the Northern Territories. Adrian stood close beside her, leaning in to follow her finger across the paper. Their heads were nearly touching. Candlelight pooled between them and caught the deep emerald fabric of Seraphina's dress, turning her into something luminous. She was explaining the irrigation system she had proposed for the eastern fields. Her voice carried the quiet authority Caedric had heard before but never truly listened to, the voice of someone who understood the estate's machinery better than anyone alive, including him. Adrian said something Caedric could not hear. Seraphina laughed. The sound struck Caedric like a physical blow, not because he recognized it, because he did not. In 2 years of marriage, he had never once heard his wife laugh. The realization landed somewhere deep inside his chest and stayed there, lodged like a splinter he could not reach. He continued down the staircase. He entered the library. Both of them turned toward him with the easy composure of people who had nothing to hide, and that composure bothered him more than guilt would have. "Lord Mortimer," Caedric said, "I trust the survey is progressing." "Beyond expectations, Your Grace." Adrian straightened respectfully but without deference. The distinction was subtle and infuriating. "The Duchess has been extraordinarily generous with her time. Your estate reforms are genuinely remarkable." "Her reforms," Caedric corrected. The words left his mouth before he understood why he had said them. A silence followed. Seraphina looked at Caedric with an expression he could not read. It was not surprise. It was not gratitude. It was something closer to the way a scientist looks at an experiment that has produced an unexpected variable. "Dinner is served," Mrs. Hale announced from the corridor. They dined together that evening for the first time in months, the three of them at the long mahogany table beneath the crystal chandelier. Adrian dominated the conversation with effortless charm, moving between agricultural policy, London gossip, and literary references with the fluency of a man who had spent his life in rooms where conversation was considered an art form. Caedric contributed almost nothing. He ate mechanically, watching Adrian refill Seraphina's wine glass without being asked, watching Seraphina tilt her head slightly when she listened to Adrian speak, a gesture of genuine attention that Caedric realized, with a sensation very close to nausea, she had never once directed at him. After dinner, Adrian retired to the guest wing. Seraphina stood to leave the dining room. Caedric spoke without planning to. "He seems familiar with you." Seraphina stopped near the doorway. She turned halfway, her profile caught in the dying candlelight. "He is a guest performing a government survey. He is familiar with the estate. There is a difference." I noticed no difference at the dinner table. Something hardened behind Seraphina's eyes. The subtle shift of a woman who has absorbed insult so many times that she can identify its approach from across a room. You noticed something at the dinner table, she said quietly. That might be the first time you have noticed anything about me since our wedding day. She left. Caedric sat alone at the empty table for a long time, staring at the place where she had been sitting, and the splinter in his chest worked itself deeper and deeper and deeper, until it touched something he had spent his entire life pretending was not there. He poured another glass of wine and drank it in silence. In the courtyard below the dining room windows, snow began to fall. And somewhere in the guest wing of Ravenshire Castle, Lord Adrian Mortimer sat at a writing desk composing a letter to his colleague in London that contained a single sentence that would, if Caedric ever read it, have confirmed every irrational fear already multiplying inside his skull like a virus. I have found something extraordinary here, and I do not think I can leave it behind. The letter never reached London. Caedric's valet, a gaunt man named Hargreaves who had served the Ravenshire household since the previous duke's reign, intercepted it during the routine morning mail collection. Not because he had been instructed to, because 30 years of service inside this castle had taught him to read atmospheric pressure the way old sailors read the sky, and the pressure inside Ravenshire had been dropping dangerously for days. Hargreaves brought the letter to Caedric's study at 6:30 in the morning, before the rest of the household had stirred. He placed it on the desk beside the untouched coffee and said nothing. He did not need to. The Mortimer seal on the back of the envelope said everything. Caedric read the letter standing up. 1 sentence, 9 words, and every single one of them detonated inside his chest like shrapnel from a device he had not known was buried there. He read it again, then a third time. His fingers tightened on the paper until the edges crumpled inward, and he stood motionless for nearly a full minute, his breathing controlled with the deliberate precision of a man who understands that the moment he stops controlling it, something irreversible will happen. "Will there be a response, Your Grace?" Hargreaves asked from the doorway. "No." "Shall I dispose of it?" Caedric folded the letter and placed it inside the top drawer of his desk. The gesture was careful, almost surgical, the way a man files evidence he knows he will need later. "Leave me," he said. Hargreaves left. The door closed with a soft click that sounded, in the cavernous silence of the study, like a rifle being cocked. Caedric stood behind his desk and stared through the frost-covered window at the courtyard below, where groundskeepers were clearing the overnight snow. His reflection stared back at him from the glass, translucent, superimposed over the white landscape like a ghost haunting its own estate. He had not slept. He had sat in the dining room until the candles burned to stumps, then moved to his study and spent the remaining hours reviewing documents he could not concentrate on, reading the same paragraphs over and over while his mind circled back to the same image. Seraphina's head tilted toward Adrian, the angle of her attention, the geometry of interest he had never once inspired in her. The rational part of his brain, the part that had governed every decision he had made since inheriting the dukedom at 23, told him this was manageable. A visiting bureaucrat had developed an admiration for the Duchess. It was not unusual. It was not even noteworthy. Men admired beautiful women. It meant nothing unless someone allowed it to mean something. But beneath that rationality, in the deeper architecture of Caedric Ravenshire's psychology, something far older and far less civilized was waking up. The part of him that did not think in terms of logic and probability, the part that operated on instinct so primitive it predated language, the territorial machinery that recognizes a threat, not through evidence, but through sensation, through the tightening of skin, through the acceleration of pulse, through the sudden, overwhelming certainty that something belonging to you is being examined by hands that have no right to touch it. He had never wanted Seraphina. He knew that. He had accepted her the way a man accepts a clause in a contract he has already decided to sign, as an obligation attached to something he actually valued. The alliance with the Vale family, the political leverage, the territorial consolidation. But want and ownership are different animals. And Caedric Ravenshire had been raised inside a dynasty that understood ownership the way wolves understand territory. You do not need to love every acre you patrol. You simply need to ensure that nothing crosses the boundary without your permission. Adrian Mortimer had crossed the boundary, and the letter in the drawer confirmed it. Caedric dressed for the day with mechanical precision. Dark wool coat, pressed collar, boots polished to a mirror finish. Every element of his appearance was a form of control, armor assembled piece by piece against a world that responded to visual authority before it responded to anything else. He descended to the breakfast room at precisely 7:30 and found Adrian already seated, eating toast and reading a newspaper with the relaxed posture of a man who felt entirely welcome. "Good morning, Your Grace," Adrian said, standing briefly with a courteous nod. "Magnificent estate. I slept better here than I have in months." Caedric sat at the head of the table without returning the greeting. A footman poured his coffee. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was strategic. Caedric had learned decades ago that silence was the cheapest weapon available to powerful men, and he deployed it now with the patience of someone who understood that most people would fill a vacuum if you let them sit inside it long enough. Adrian lasted approximately 90 seconds. "I was hoping to spend the morning reviewing the Eastern irrigation proposals with the Duchess," he said, folding his newspaper. "The Ministry will want detailed projections, and her understanding of the soil composition data is frankly more sophisticated than anything my team has produced. The Duchess has other obligations this morning." "Oh, I was not aware. She mentioned yesterday that she has other obligations." The repetition landed like a door closing. Adrian studied Caedric's face for a moment, and something shifted behind his pleasant expression. Not fear, recognition. The careful recalibration of a man who has just identified the true nature of the terrain he is standing on. "Of course," Adrian said. "Perhaps this afternoon, then." "Perhaps." They finished breakfast in silence. Adrian excused himself to work with his assistants in the guest wing. Caedric remained at the table, his coffee untouched, his jaw locked so tightly that the muscles in his temples pulsed visibly beneath his skin. Seraphina arrived in the breakfast room 15 minutes later, wearing a riding coat and leather gloves, clearly preparing for a morning visit to the tenant villages. "Good morning," she said. "Sit down." The command was quiet, but unmistakable. Seraphina paused halfway to the sideboard. She turned slowly and looked at him. "I beg your pardon?" "I said sit down. We need to discuss Lord Mortimer's visit." Seraphina sat. Not because the command compelled her, because something in his voice, a frequency she had never heard before, caught her attention the way a strange sound in the night makes a person stop breathing to listen. "What about his visit?" she asked. "How much longer does the survey require?" "Another week at minimum. The Eastern Territories alone will take 3 or 4 days to assess properly." "He can assess them from the documents. I want him gone by Friday." Seraphina's expression did not change, but her hands, resting on the table, went very still. "May I ask why?" "You may not." "Then I will tell you anyway. His survey has been commissioned by the Ministry of Lands. Cutting it short would be an insult to the ministry and a disservice to the estate. Our reforms are the reason his office sent him here. If we obstruct the evaluation, we lose the political capital those reforms have earned. I am not interested in political capital." "Since when?" The question hung between them like a blade suspended by a thread. Caedric's eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made the air between them feel pressurized, as though the room itself was contracting. "Since a man I do not know began spending more time with my wife than I have in 2 years of marriage." The words came out harder than he intended. Rawer. He heard them leave his mouth and felt something close to vertigo. The disorientation of a man who has accidentally revealed a wound he did not know he had. Seraphina stared at him. For a long time she simply stared, and in her silence Caedric saw something he had never seen directed at him before. Not anger, not defiance, something worse. Pity. "Your wife," she repeated softly. "You have never once called me that." "It is what you are." "No. It is what a marriage contract says I am. What I actually am inside this house is furniture, Caedric. Expensive, well-maintained furniture that you walk past every day without seeing. And now that someone else has noticed the furniture exists, you are suddenly concerned about the inventory. That is not what this is." "Then tell me what it is." He could not. The machinery of his emotional vocabulary had been built without the components necessary to answer that question. He had words for strategy, for negotiation, for command. He did not have words for the sensation currently tearing through his chest like a serrated wire, the sick, breathless awareness that something he had neglected for years might be valuable, might be essential, and he was only discovering it because someone else had discovered it first. "Cancel the Eastern tour," he said instead. "Mortimer can complete his survey from the records in the estate office." Seraphina stood. "No," she said. The word detonated in the breakfast room with the quiet force of a grenade dropped into still water. Caedric's chin lifted slightly, the involuntary response of a man whose authority has been challenged so rarely that his body does not quite know how to process the sensation. "I have spent 2 years building something real on this estate," Seraphina continued. "Something that feeds people and educates children and keeps families alive through winters that would have killed them under your steward's management. Lord Mortimer's survey validates that work. It proves that what I did matters, and I will not sabotage it because you have suddenly decided to notice that I exist." She pulled on her riding gloves with sharp, efficient motions. "I'm going to the northern villages. Lord Mortimer's assistants are mapping the eastern fields today. If you have concerns about the survey's scope, I suggest you take them up with the ministry." She left. Caedric sat alone in the breakfast room and listened to her boots crossing the stone floor of the entrance hall, then the front doors opening, then the sound of hooves on frozen gravel. He pressed both palms flat against the table. His fingers were shaking, not with rage, with something he had no name for, something that lived beneath rage, in the basement of the psyche where the things men refuse to feel go to rot. He stood abruptly, knocking his coffee cup sideways. Brown liquid pooled across the white tablecloth like a stain spreading through fabric that could never be fully cleaned. The days that followed were a masterclass in controlled deterioration. Caedric did not confront Adrian again directly. Instead, he began orbiting, appearing in rooms where Adrian was working, standing at windows overlooking paths where Adrian walked, requesting reports from Blackwood about the survey's progress with a frequency that made the steward visibly uncomfortable. He attended dinner every evening now, a dramatic shift from months of eating alone in his study. He sat at the head of the table and watched Adrian and Seraphina interact with the fixed attention of a predator tracking movement through tall grass. Adrian, to his credit, gave him almost nothing to work with. The man was scrupulously professional. He addressed Seraphina with formal courtesy. He never touched her. He never leaned closer than propriety allowed. His conversation was warm but never intimate, clever but never flirtatious. But Caedric was not watching for violations of etiquette. He was watching for something far more dangerous. He was watching for the invisible current that runs between two people who understand each other, the shared frequency that does not require touch or transgression to communicate its meaning. He saw it in the way Adrian's questions drew out thoughts Seraphina had clearly been carrying alone for years. He saw it in the way her posture changed when Adrian entered a room, a subtle straightening, as though she was remembering that she was allowed to take up space. He saw it in the rhythm of their conversation, the way they finished each other's analytical threads with an ease that suggested their minds were built from compatible architecture. It was worse than an affair. An affair could be punished. An affair was a violation with clear boundaries, something that could be identified, confronted, and destroyed. What was happening between Seraphina and Adrian was not a violation. It was a demonstration. A demonstration that someone else could see in Seraphina what Caedric had been too blind, too proud, too fundamentally broken to recognize. On the 5th evening, after a dinner where Adrian had made Seraphina laugh 3 separate times while Caedric contributed nothing beyond monosyllabic responses to direct questions, the Duke retreated to his study and poured whiskey with hands that were no longer entirely steady. He stood at the window and watched snow fall into the courtyard. His reflection stared back from the dark glass. Gaunt, hard, the face of a man who had governed through intimidation for so long that he had forgotten he possessed any other instrument. His father's voice surfaced from somewhere deep in his memory. The old Duke, dead 7 years now, had been a monument to emotional austerity. He had raised Caedric the way you raise a hunting dog, with discipline, deprivation, and the systematic elimination of any impulse that could not be converted into utility. Need is weakness, the old man had said. The only things worth having are the things you can hold without needing them. Caedric had built his entire life on that foundation. Every relationship, every decision, every interaction with every human being who had ever entered his orbit had been filtered through that single principle. Hold without needing, want without requiring, possess without depending. And it had worked. For years it had worked flawlessly. He had inherited a struggling dukedom and transformed it into a political powerhouse through sheer force of will and the absolute refusal to let any person or any emotion gain leverage over him. Then a woman he had married out of obligation had spent 2 years quietly becoming the most competent person on his estate, and a stranger had walked through his front door and seen it immediately. And Caedric was standing alone in his study at midnight, drinking whiskey and trembling, because the foundation his entire identity was built on had just revealed itself to be rotten. He drained the glass, poured another, drained that too. The 6th day broke with pale winter sunlight, and Caedric made a decision that would destroy everything. He sent a letter to Lord Ashton in London. The letter requested, in language that was diplomatically precise and personally vicious, that the Ministry of Lands recall Lord Mortimer's survey team immediately, citing concerns about the scope of access granted to Ravenshire's private financial records. The letter was a lie. Adrian had accessed nothing beyond what Seraphina had voluntarily shared, all of which was within the standard parameters of a ministerial evaluation. But Caedric knew that the accusation itself would be enough. In aristocratic politics, the suggestion of impropriety carried the same weight as proof. Adrian would be recalled, the survey would be terminated, and the man who had made Seraphina laugh would disappear from Ravenshire as cleanly as if he had never existed. Caedric sealed the letter and gave it to a courier before breakfast. He felt nothing. Or rather, he felt the specific numbness that follows a decision made from panic rather than strategy, the hollow certainty that you have done something irreversible and the refusal to examine whether it was right. He did not tell Seraphina. He did not need to. Mrs. Hale told her. The housekeeper had overheard the courier's instructions and understood immediately what was happening. She found Seraphina in the estate office that afternoon and relayed the information with the careful neutrality of a woman who had learned that delivering bad news accurately was more important than delivering it gently. Seraphina listened. She asked Mrs. Hale to repeat the key details. Then she thanked her and sat alone in the office for 20 minutes without moving. When she stood, she walked directly to Caedric's study. She did not knock. Caedric was standing at the window with his back to the door. He turned when she entered, and the expression on her face stopped whatever reflexive command had been forming on his lips. "You sent a letter to London," she said. "Not a question." "I did. You accused Adrian of exceeding his survey authority, of accessing private financial records without authorization. I raised concerns. You lied." The word filled the room. Caedric's jaw tightened, but he did not deny it. Denial would have required admitting that the truth mattered, and in his current state, the truth was an enemy he could not afford to engage. "Lord Mortimer's presence on this estate has become disruptive," he said. "I exercised my right as Duke to address the disruption." "Disruptive to whom?" "To the estate. The estate has never functioned better. You know that. Every metric confirms it. The disruption is not to Ravenshire, Caedric. The disruption is to you." "This conversation is over." "No, it is not." Seraphina's voice did not rise. It lowered. And the drop in volume carried more force than any shout could have. The controlled quiet of a woman who has reached the limit of what she is willing to endure. "You ignored me for 2 years. You told me on our 9th night as husband and wife that you married my family's name, not me. You built a life inside this castle that had no room for me in it. And when I built my own life anyway, when I built something that actually works, you did not notice. You did not care. But the moment another man noticed, the moment someone looked at me and saw a person instead of a line item in a contract, you panicked. And your response was not to become someone worth noticing. Your response was to destroy the person who noticed." Caedric's breathing had changed, shorter, shallower. The respiration pattern of a man whose body is preparing for confrontation while his mind scrambles for ground that keeps shifting beneath him. "He is in love with you," Caedric said. "You do not know that." "I read his letter." Silence. Seraphina's expression went through 3 distinct phases in the space of 5 seconds. Confusion, realization, then something cold and final, like watching a door close from the wrong side. You intercepted his private correspondence. Hargreaves brought it to me. And you read it. Yes. What did it say? Caedric hesitated. And in that hesitation, Seraphina saw everything she needed to see. Whatever the letter contained, it had wounded him. Not his pride. Something deeper. Something he could not control. It does not matter what it said, Caedric answered. It matters enough that you sabotaged a government survey, lied to the Ministry of Lands, and are about to humiliate a man who has done nothing wrong. So yes, Caedric, it matters. He called you extraordinary. The word landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples spread outward in every direction. Extraordinary, Seraphina repeated. He said he found something extraordinary here and could not leave it behind. Seraphina was quiet for a very long time. And that frightened you, she said finally. It was not a question, it was a diagnosis. And Caedric's silence confirmed it with more honesty than any confession could have. You are frightened, she continued, because someone described your wife the way you never have, the way you never thought to, and instead of asking yourself why you never saw it, you decided to eliminate the man who did. Caedric turned back to the window. His reflection stared at him from the glass, and for the first time in his life, he did not recognize the man staring back. The face was the same. The jaw, the slate-gray eyes, the tension lines carved into a forehead that had carried the weight of a dynasty since adolescence. But something behind the face had shifted. Some internal structure had buckled under a load it was never designed to bear. You cannot send that letter, Seraphina said from behind him. It is already sent. Then send another retracting it. No. Caedric. I said no. Seraphina exhaled slowly. The sound was not frustration. It was something worse. Finality. Then this is the last conversation we will have about this, she said. Because when Adrian is recalled, and the ministry investigates your accusation, and they discover it was fabricated, the scandal will not destroy him. It will destroy you, and I will not be standing beside you when it does. Caedric turned from the window. What does that mean? It means I am finished pretending that this marriage is something it has never been. I stayed because I believed the work I was doing here mattered, and it does. But I will not remain in a house where my value is only recognized when another man confirms it. She walked to the door. Her hand rested on the handle. Retract the letter, Caedric, or I leave Ravenshire. The door closed behind her with a sound so quiet it could have been a whisper, and the study collapsed into silence, and Caedric Ravenshire stood at the window and watched the snow fall, and felt, with absolute clarity, the precise moment his entire world began to split apart at the seams. The courier was already 15 miles south of the estate, riding hard toward London through frozen mud. And the Duke of Ravenshire had exactly 48 hours before the lie he had told reached the one place where lies have consequences. Caedric did not sleep that night. He did not attempt to. Sleep required the surrender of control, and control was the only thing standing between him and the full weight of what he had done. He sat in his study until the fire died, then sat in the darkness after that, the letter from Adrian Mortimer still locked in his desk drawer like a confession belonging to someone else. The whiskey decanter stood empty on the side table. He had drained it methodically across the hours, not for comfort, but for occupation, because his hands needed to hold something, and the alternative was holding nothing while his mind tore itself apart. The courier was 30 miles south by now, maybe more, riding through frozen darkness toward London with a document that would detonate Caedric's reputation, his political standing, and the last threadbare remnant of whatever Seraphina still felt for him, all because he had been too proud to name the thing eating him alive and too cowardly to face it without a weapon in his hand. He had built an empire on the principle that vulnerability was extinction, that the moment you allowed another person to see inside you, they owned something you could never retrieve. His father had drilled that lesson into him before he could read. His father had reinforced it through a childhood so barren of warmth that Caedric could not recall a single instance of physical affection before the age of 12, not a hand on his shoulder, not an arm around him during a storm. Nothing. Just instruction, expectation, and the relentless pressure to become a man who needed no one because needing someone was the first step toward being destroyed by them. The lesson had worked. For 31 years it had worked perfectly. Caedric Ravenshire needed no one. He wanted nothing he could not acquire through leverage. He feared nothing except the loss of authority, and since authority was maintained through discipline rather than emotion, the system was self-sustaining, impenetrable, flawless. Then Seraphina had said the word leave, and the system had collapsed in under 3 seconds. He replayed the moment constantly. Not her arguments, not the accusation about the letter, or the fabricated complaint, or the political consequences. Just the word itself. Leave. The way it left her mouth without trembling, the way her eyes held his without blinking, the absolute absence of bluff in her voice. She was not threatening, she was informing. And the difference between those two things was the difference between a warning shot and a bullet already fired. At 4 a.m, he stood from his desk and walked to the window. The courtyard was empty, glazed in moonlight that turned the frozen ground into something resembling polished bone. His reflection stared back at him, and for the second time in 2 days, the face in the glass belonged to a stranger. A man hollowed out from the inside, wearing the exterior of someone who still commanded respect while the internal structure crumbled like plaster behind a facade. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass and closed his eyes. He needed to recall the courier. He knew that. The rational calculation was not complicated. If the letter reached Lord Ashton, an investigation would follow. The investigation would reveal that Adrian Mortimer had accessed nothing beyond publicly shareable agricultural data. The accusation would be exposed as fabrication. Caedric would face censure from the ministry, possible sanctions from the Privy Council, and the permanent stain of having weaponized government channels to settle a personal grievance. His political enemies, who had been circling Ravenshire's influence for years, would use the scandal like a battering ram. He needed to recall the courier. The math was obvious, the decision was simple, but the decision required admitting that the letter should never have been sent. And admitting the letter should never have been sent required admitting why he sent it. And admitting why he sent it required confronting a truth so fundamental and so terrifying that his entire identity had been constructed specifically to avoid it. He was afraid of losing Seraphina, not as a political asset, not as a contractual obligation, as the only person inside his life who had ever built something real while he built walls. And that fear made him dangerous, not to his enemies, to her. He opened his eyes. The courtyard was still empty, the moon was still cold, and the courier was still riding south. Caedric straightened. He crossed to his desk. He pulled open the bottom drawer and removed a second sheet of stationery, dipped his pen, and began writing. The recall letter was 3 sentences, direct, unambiguous. He ordered the courier to return to Ravenshire immediately and surrender the original correspondence without delivering it. He sealed it with his ring and summoned the night steward. "Send the fastest rider we have south on the London road," he said. "He is looking for a courier bearing the Ravenshire seal. The man cannot have reached Ashford yet if the roads are as frozen as they appear. Intercept him. Bring back my letter, and do not speak of this to anyone." The steward nodded and disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness. Caedric stood in the doorway and watched the rider mount and thunder through the gates. The sound of hooves on frozen ground faded into silence, and he was alone again, and the only thought in his head was a question he could not answer. Was he recalling the letter because it was the right thing to do, or because Seraphina had told him to? He did not know. And the inability to distinguish between conscience and compliance frightened him more than anything Adrian Mortimer had ever written. Dawn arrived gray and reluctant. Frost clung to every surface as though the estate itself was holding its breath. Seraphina appeared at breakfast looking exactly the same as she always did, composed, precise, her dark hair pinned back with the efficient severity she favored, her posture carrying the upright discipline of a woman who had learned that presentation was a form of defense. She wore a gray dress, the color of overcast sky, and Caedric noticed, with a specificity that surprised him, that it made her eyes look darker than usual, almost black. He noticed because he was looking at her, actually looking. Not assessing, not cataloging, looking. It occurred to him, sitting at the head of his own breakfast table, that he did not know what color his wife's eyes were. He had married her. He had lived under the same roof with her for over 2 years. He had stood across from her in a cathedral and spoken vows that legally bound their lives together. And he did not know the color of her eyes. They were dark blue, almost violet in certain light. He was seeing it now for the first time, and the discovery felt less like noticing something new and more like being convicted of something he could never undo. "I sent a rider to recall the courier," he said. Seraphina set down her tea. She did not look at him. "When?" "4 this morning. The roads are frozen. The courier could not have reached Ashford before dawn. The rider should intercept him by midday." "Should." "Will." "And if he does not?" Caedric paused. "Then I will ride to London myself and withdraw the complaint in person." Seraphina looked at him now. Her expression was unreadable, not because she was hiding her thoughts, but because the thoughts themselves were too complex to resolve into a single emotion. She was studying him the way she had studied the estate's finances 2 years ago, with the patient, analytical attention of someone trying to determine whether a broken system was worth repairing or whether the damage was structural. "Why?" she asked. "Because you were right. The accusation was fabricated. Sending it would have been—" "I am not asking why you recalled the letter. I am asking why you sent it in the first place." He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I do not know how to answer that." "Yes, you do. You are choosing not to." The accuracy of the observation landed like a blade pressed flat against his throat. Not cutting, just resting there, letting him feel the edge. Adrian appeared in the doorway before Caedric could respond. "Good morning," Adrian said, nodding to both of them with the measured courtesy of a man who could feel atmospheric pressure dropping but had decided to behave as though the weather was fine. "I wanted to let you know that my team has completed the Eastern Field assessments. We should be finished with the survey by Thursday." "Thursday," Caedric repeated. "If that timeline works for you, Your Grace." "It does." Adrian looked at Seraphina. Something passed between them, brief and nearly invisible, a flicker of concern in his eyes, and a fractional shake of her head that said, "Not now." Caedric saw the exchange. He saw it and felt the serrated wire in his chest tighten another quarter turn, and he understood with nauseating clarity that they had developed their own shorthand, their own private language of glances and gestures, built across shared meals and afternoon walks and conversations about irrigation yields and school funding. They had built intimacy without ever touching, and that was worse. That was infinitely worse than anything physical would have been, because physical transgression could be fought. You could rage against it, punish it, use it as evidence of someone else's failure. But emotional intimacy, the quiet construction of mutual understanding between two people who recognized each other, that could not be fought. It could not be punished. It could only be witnessed, and the witnessing was its own kind of destruction. Adrian excused himself. The dining room settled back into silence. "He is leaving Thursday," Caedric said, as though the statement contained information Seraphina did not already possess. "I heard." "Will that be sufficient?" "Sufficient for what?" "For whatever you need from him." Seraphina put down her tea with a controlled motion that was worse than slamming it. Her eyes met his, and in them Caedric saw something he had never seen directed at him before. Not anger, not exhaustion. Contempt. "I need information from him," she said quietly. "Agricultural data, financial projections, ministerial contacts that can protect the reforms I built on your estate while you were too busy being a monument to notice that people were starving. That is what I need from him. And the fact that your mind goes somewhere else tells me more about your character than anything you have said in 2 years of marriage." She stood and left the room. Caedric sat alone. The contempt in her eyes stayed with him like a burn mark on skin, and he understood, with the delayed comprehension of a man who has been looking at the wrong problem for weeks, that the threat to his marriage was not Adrian Mortimer. It had never been Adrian Mortimer. The threat was himself. The rider returned at 1:30 in the afternoon, muddy, frozen, and empty-handed. Caedric saw him from the study window, dismounting in the courtyard with the body language of a man carrying bad news. He descended the staircase and met the rider in the entrance hall. "The courier reached the Ashford relay station at dawn, Your Grace," the rider reported, his breath still clouding in the cold air. "He exchanged horses and continued south before I arrived. The station master said he was riding priority dispatch. He will reach London by nightfall." Caedric stood very still. Around him, the entrance hall stretched in every direction, portraits in stone and shadow, the architecture of generations staring down at the man who was about to dismantle everything they had built. "You are dismissed," he said. The rider left. Caedric remained in the entrance hall, motionless, while the grandfather clock marked seconds that sounded like small detonations. The letter would reach Lord Ashton tomorrow morning. By afternoon, the ministry would open an inquiry. By week's end, Adrian Mortimer would receive a formal summons. Ravenshire's agricultural reforms would be frozen pending investigation, and the scandal would begin spreading through the aristocracy like infection through an open wound. And Seraphina would leave. That was the part his mind kept returning to, the gravitational center around which every other consequence orbited. The political fallout was manageable. The ministry inquiry was survivable. The reputational damage was significant, but recoverable for a man with Caedric's resources. But Seraphina leaving was not recoverable, because Seraphina leaving meant that the only person who had ever built something valuable inside his life would walk away, and she would walk away knowing that he had destroyed himself not out of strength but out of weakness, not out of conviction but out of the pathetic corrosive terror of a man who could not tolerate being seen as unnecessary. He needed to get to London before the letter did. The calculation was brutal and simple. The courier had a 12-hour head start and fresh horses. Caedric had exhausted mounts and frozen roads in the approaching darkness of a February afternoon. The mathematical probability of intercepting the letter before delivery was negligible. But Duke of Ravenshire had not built a political empire by respecting mathematical probability. He had built it by doing things that rational men considered impossible, through sheer, reckless, overwhelming force of will. He ordered his fastest horse saddled. He changed into riding clothes. He descended to the courtyard as the grooms brought out a black stallion named Sovereign, 16 hands of muscle and fury that had never been ridden by anyone except Caedric himself. He was mounting when a voice stopped him. "Where are you going?" Seraphina stood in the castle doorway, her arms wrapped against the cold, her dark hair catching the gray afternoon light. She looked smaller than usual against the massive stone frame of the entrance, and something about that image, the vastness of the architecture he had inherited, and the solitary figure of the woman he had neglected standing dwarfed inside it, hit him with a force that nearly knocked the breath from his lungs. "London," he said. "You cannot reach London before the courier." "I can try." "Trying is not a strategy, it is desperation." "Then I am desperate." The word left his mouth before he could stop it, and it hung in the frozen air between them, visible almost, like breath made solid. Desperate. The Duke of Ravenshire had just used a word he had spent his entire adult life treating as profanity, and he had said it to the one person whose judgment he could least afford to face. Seraphina stared at him. Her expression shifted, not softening exactly, but rearranging. The contempt from breakfast was still there, but something else had joined it. Something that looked in the gray February light almost like grief. "You did this to yourself," she said. "You understand that." "I understand it." "Then why are you riding to London instead of standing here and telling me that?" "Because telling you does not fix what I broke." "And riding through a snowstorm does?" "It might stop the damage from becoming permanent." Seraphina was quiet for a long moment. Wind moved across the courtyard, lifting loose snow into spirals that dissolved against the castle walls. "Nothing about this is going to stop being permanent, Caedric," she said softly. "You read another man's private letter. You fabricated an accusation against him. You tried to use the machinery of government to punish someone whose only offense was treating your wife like a human being. Even if you catch the courier, even if you burn the letter and no one in London ever reads a word of it, I will still know you did it. That is the part you cannot recall." The stallion shifted beneath him, stamping against the frozen ground. Caedric's hands tightened on the reins. "I know," he said. "Do you? Because you are sitting on a horse right now, preparing to ride 90 miles in the dark. And I think you believe that if you fix the external problem, the internal one disappears. It does not. It never does. The letter is not the disease, Caedric. The letter is the symptom, and the disease is standing right here in the courtyard, sitting on a very expensive horse, still trying to control everything instead of feeling anything." Caedric looked down at her from the saddle. The distance between them was perhaps 10 feet, but it felt continental. She stood below him on the frozen cobblestones, looking up, and the geometry of the moment, him elevated, her grounded, felt suddenly and horribly wrong. As though every power structure he had ever inhabited was revealing itself to be an inversion of reality. He was not above her. He had never been above her. He had simply positioned himself at a height from which he could avoid seeing her clearly, and now that he was seeing her, the altitude felt like falling. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. The question came out raw, stripped of authority, the voice of a man asking for directions in a country where he does not speak the language. Seraphina looked at him for a long time. "Get off the horse," she said. He did not move. "Get off the horse, Caedric." He dismounted. His boots hit the cobblestones with a sound that echoed off the castle walls. He stood holding the reins in one hand, the stallion breathing clouds of vapor behind him, and he waited. "Now walk inside," she said. "Sit down at your desk. Write a letter to Lord Ashton explaining that your previous correspondence contained errors and should be disregarded. Send it by morning post. And then come find me and tell me the truth about why you did what you did. Not the political reason, not the strategic justification. The real reason. The one you have been running from since the night of our wedding." She turned and walked back into the castle. Caedric stood in the courtyard holding his horse's reins. Snow began to fall again, soft and relentless, dusting the shoulders of his riding coat and the stallion's dark mane. The groom hovered at a distance, uncertain whether to approach. The Duke of Ravenshire stood in the snow and felt the full weight of a life built on the principle that strength meant never needing anyone. He felt it pressing down on him from every direction, crushing and absolute. And beneath it, in the wreckage of everything he thought he was, he felt something he had not felt since childhood. Terror, pure, unmanageable, annihilating terror. Not of losing his title, not of political ruin, not of scandal or censure or the collapse of the Ravenshire name. Terror of walking into that castle and saying the words that would make him human. Because being human meant being breakable. And being breakable meant that Seraphina could destroy him, not through betrayal, not through abandonment, through the simple, devastating act of seeing him as he actually was and deciding that what she saw was not enough. He handed the reins to the groom. He walked toward the castle doors. And as the doors closed behind him, somewhere inside the east wing, Thomas Blackwood, the steward who had served Ravenshire for 15 years and who had been quietly copying estate financial records into a private ledger for the past 3 months, sealed a packet of documents and addressed them to Lord Harwick, the Duke's most aggressive political rival, with a note that read, "The household is fractured. Move now." The betrayal Caedric Ravenshire had been preparing for was never coming from Adrian Mortimer. It had been sitting at his own desk the entire time. The packet reached Lord Harwick's estate in Cheltenham 41 hours after Blackwood sealed it. Caedric did not know. He was sitting in his study, staring at the retraction letter he had written to Lord Ashton, reading it for the 9th time, trying to determine whether the language was sufficiently precise to undo the damage without admitting the full scope of his failure. The words blurred. He had not eaten since the previous morning. His hands had developed a fine tremor he could not will away, and the tremor infuriated him because it was evidence, physical, undeniable evidence, that his body had stopped obeying the commands his mind issued. He sealed the retraction and placed it on the silver tray for the morning post. Then he sat in silence and tried to assemble the words Seraphina had demanded. The real reason. The one he had been running from since the night of their wedding. He knew what the words were. They had been forming in the basement of his consciousness for days, maybe weeks, pressing upward against the machinery of suppression he had spent a lifetime constructing. But knowing the words existed and being capable of speaking them were different operations entirely. Speaking them required dismantling the architecture of who he was. It required standing in front of another human being and admitting that the man everyone feared was, at his foundation, a man terrified of being known. He pressed his palms against his eyes until he saw white sparks. Then he stood and went to find her. Seraphina was in the estate office, seated behind the large desk she had quietly commandeered from Blackwood over the previous year. Ledgers were spread before her. A candle burned low at her elbow. She was writing something in the margin of a tenant report, her handwriting small and precise. and she did not look up when Caedric entered. He closed the door behind him. The sound of the latch made her pause. She set down her pen and waited. Caedric stood 6 feet from the desk, close enough to speak without raising his voice, far enough that the distance between them still felt like a declaration. "You asked me to tell you the truth," he said. "I did. I do not know how." Seraphina looked at him. Her expression was neutral in the way a surgeon's expression is neutral before an operation, focused, alert, and entirely withholding judgment until the extent of the damage became clear. "Start anywhere," she said. He swallowed. The sound was audible in the quiet room. "When Arabella died, I did not mourn her. I mourned the arrangement, the structure, the plan I had built around a woman I had met 3 times and felt nothing for beyond the recognition that she was suitable. When your family offered you as a replacement, I accepted because refusing would have cost me the Vale alliance, and the alliance was more valuable to me than any individual person attached to it." He paused. His jaw worked silently, the muscles contracting and releasing as though his body was physically wrestling with the words. "On our wedding night, I told you that you could have everything except love. I said it because I believed it was honest. I believed I was incapable of it, not unwilling, incapable. My father raised me inside a system that treated emotional connection as structural weakness. He taught me that the only safe relationship between a man and another person was one defined by utility. You were useful. The marriage was useful. Anything beyond that was a liability I could not afford." Seraphina's face had not changed. She sat perfectly still, her hands resting on the desk, and Caedric realized she was giving him something he had never given her: uninterrupted attention. "When you began rebuilding the tenant villages, I dismissed it. I called it charity. I told Blackwood to let you do what you wanted because I genuinely believed it did not matter. The estate's real power came from parliamentary alliances and political leverage, not from whether farmers could feed their children. That is what I believed. That is who I was." His voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper, not from weakness, but from the effort of forcing honesty through vocal cords trained for command. Then Adrian arrived, and he looked at what you built and called it extraordinary, and I hated him for it. Not because he was wrong, because he was right. And his being right meant that I had been wrong for 2 years. It meant that the most valuable thing on this estate was not the parliamentary influence or the Ravenshire name or the political machinery I spent a decade constructing. It was you. And I had not seen it. I had looked directly at it every single day and refused to see it, because seeing it would have required admitting that I needed something I could not control. He stopped. His breathing was ragged. The tremor in his hands had migrated to his voice, and he clenched his fists at his sides to contain it. "I sent the letter because destroying Adrian was easier than becoming someone worth your attention. That is the truth. That is the real reason." The silence that followed was the longest of Caedric Ravenshire's life. Seraphina sat behind the desk and looked at him, and in her eyes he saw something he had not earned and did not deserve. Not forgiveness. Something earlier and more fragile than forgiveness. Recognition. The acknowledgement that the man standing before her had, for the first time in their marriage, spoken to her as though she were real. She opened her mouth to respond. The door exploded inward. Thomas Blackwood stood in the doorway, breathing hard, his face carrying the particular expression of a man who has just learned that his carefully constructed exit strategy has developed a complication. "Your Grace," he said, addressing Caedric with a formality that no longer concealed anything. "Lord Harwick's representatives have arrived at the gate. They are requesting immediate access to the estate." Caedric's entire body went still. Not the stillness of composure, the stillness of a man whose survival instincts have just overridden every other system in his body. "Harwick," he repeated. "He sent a delegation of 4. They carry documents they claim authorize an inspection of Ravenshire's financial records on behalf of the House of Lords Committee on Territorial Governance. No such inspection has been authorized. They say it has. They have papers." Caedric's mind, which moments ago had been engaged in the most vulnerable act of his life, shifted gears with a violence that was almost audible. The emotional machinery retracted, the political machinery engaged, and somewhere between the two systems, in the narrow gap where the transition occurred, Something caught. A gear that did not mesh. A fraction of hesitation that had never existed before. He looked at Seraphina. She was already on her feet, her expression transformed from careful listening to sharp calculation. Whatever personal reckoning had been unfolding between them was suspended, set aside with the practiced efficiency of two people who understood that survival always outranks sentiment. "How did Harwick know?" Seraphina asked. The question was directed at Blackwood, and the precision of it. Not what does Harwick want, not what do we do, but how did he know? Revealed the analytical mind that had restructured an entire estate's economy in under 2 years. Harwick could not have manufactured an inspection on speculation. Someone had given him information. Someone inside Ravenshire. Blackwood met her gaze. His expression did not waver, but something behind it shifted. A micro-adjustment, almost imperceptible, the kind of recalibration a practiced liar makes when assessing whether a particular audience will require a more convincing performance. "Lord Harwick has been looking for leverage against Ravenshire for years, Your Grace," Blackwood said smoothly. "The estate's recent changes may have drawn attention." "The estate's recent changes are a matter of public record," Seraphina said. "An inspection requires specific allegations. What specific information does Harwick claim to have?" Blackwood hesitated. 1 second, maybe less, but Caedric saw it, and the part of his mind that had spent a decade reading political opponents like manuscripts, scanning for the inconsistency that revealed the lie beneath the performance, locked onto that hesitation with predatory focus. "Thomas," Caedric said quietly. The use of the first name changed the temperature of the room. Blackwood had been addressed as Blackwood, or Mr. Blackwood, or Steward, for 15 years. Never Thomas. The sudden intimacy was not warmth, it was a scalpel. "How did Harwick know?" "I cannot speak to Lord Harwick's sources, Your Grace." "You can, and you will." Blackwood straightened slightly. The movement was almost defiant. Almost. But the almost was doing a great deal of work, because beneath Blackwood's professional composure something was fraying. His right hand, resting at his side, opened and closed twice. His breathing shifted to a shallower pattern. His eyes moved from Caedric to Seraphina and back with the rapid lateral tracking of a man calculating the distance to the nearest exit. Caedric saw all of it. He had been trained to see it by a father who considered the reading of men a more valuable skill than the reading of books. Every involuntary gesture was a confession. Every controlled expression was a map showing where the truth was buried. "You have been copying financial records," Caedric said. Not a question. A statement. Delivered with the flat certainty of a man who has just assembled the final piece of a pattern he should have recognized months ago. Blackwood's composure cracked. Not dramatically. A hairline fracture, visible only in the sudden rigidity of his jaw and the way his pupils dilated fractionally in the candlelight. "Your Grace, I assure you, do not." Caedric's voice dropped to a register so low it was almost subsonic. "Do not assure me of anything. You have served this house for 15 years. You have eaten at my table. You have managed my finances. You have stood in this office and called me Your Grace 10,000 times. And you have been feeding my records to the man who wants to destroy me." The room contracted around the accusation. Seraphina stood motionless near the desk, watching Blackwood with an expression that Caedric recognized as the same one she had worn the day she walked into the steward's office and demanded he withdraw the rent increases. Analytical. Unblinking. The expression of a woman assessing structural damage. Blackwood's mask held for another 3 seconds. Then it collapsed. Not with drama, not with confession, with the quiet deflation of a man who has been carrying a secret long enough to be exhausted by it. "Lord Harwick approached me 9 months ago," Blackwood said. His voice was flat now, stripped of performance. "He offered me the stewardship of his estate in Cheltenham, twice the salary, a residence, a pension. All he wanted in return was documentation of Ravenshire's internal operations. And you gave it to him. I copied the financial ledgers, the tenant agreements, the restructured contracts, the correspondence between the Duchess and the merchant guilds." "My correspondence," Seraphina said. Blackwood looked at her. Something passed across his face that might, in a different man, have been shame. "Yes." Everything I built, she said, every reform, every agreement, every number I spent 2 years assembling, you gave all of it to the man who wants to tear it apart. Lord Harwick does not want to tear it apart, Your Grace. He wants to claim it. Your reforms have made Ravenshire the most profitable estate in the northern counties. Harwick does not want to destroy that. He wants to demonstrate that the Duke is unfit to manage it. He wants a parliamentary order transferring governance of the estate to a crown-appointed administrator. His administrator. The elegance of the scheme hit Caedric like a fist to the sternum. Harwick did not need to attack Ravenshire's success. He needed to separate that success from Ravenshire's leadership. And the evidence Blackwood had provided, detailed documentation showing that the Duchess, not the Duke, was the architect of the estate's transformation, gave him exactly the narrative he needed. A Duke so disconnected from his own territory that his wife had been running it without his knowledge or involvement. A household so fractured that the Duchess had operated as a de facto independent authority. A marriage so dysfunctional that the foundation of aristocratic governance, the unified household, had been a fiction for years. Every true thing about Caedric's failures was about to be weaponized against him, and the cruelest part was that the weapon was made entirely of truth. "Get out of this room," Caedric said to Blackwood. "Your Grace, get out of this room before I do something that ends your career in a way that does not involve a pension in Cheltenham." Blackwood left. The door closed behind him, and Caedric and Seraphina stood alone in the estate office, surrounded by the ledgers and reports and tenant agreements that represented 2 years of work that had just become ammunition for their enemy. Seraphina spoke first. "Harwick's delegation is at the gate." "I know. If you refuse them entry, it confirms the narrative. A Duke with something to hide." "I know. If you admit them, they will find exactly what Blackwood gave them. Financial records showing that I restructured the estate while you managed parliamentary politics in London. They will frame it as abandonment of duty." "I know that too." "Then what are you going to do?" Caedric turned toward the window. The courtyard was visible below, and through the frost-glazed glass he could see 4 riders at the estate gate, their horses stamping in the cold, their documents held in leather cases. Harwick's men. Patient. Professional. The advance guard of a political assault designed to strip the Ravenshire dukedom of its territorial authority. Everything Caedric had built, everything his father had built, everything 5 generations of Ravenshire men had fought and bled and schemed to protect. All of it balanced on what happened in the next hour. The old Caedric would have known exactly what to do. The old Caedric would have mounted a counteroffensive built on intimidation, legal obstruction, and the strategic destruction of anyone who threatened his power. He would have summoned solicitors, called in political debts, and buried Harwick under so many procedural challenges that the inspection would have died before it started. But the old Caedric had sent a fabricated accusation against an innocent man to settle a personal grievance. The old Caedric had intercepted private correspondence. The old Caedric had neglected his wife for 2 years and then tried to control her the moment someone else recognized her value. The old Caedric's instincts were the reason they were standing in this room right now, watching an enemy walk through the gates with weapons made of their own failures. The old way was the disease, not the cure. "Let them in," Caedric said. Seraphina looked at him sharply. "If you let them in, they will have access to everything." "Good." "Good." "Caedric, they will present those records to Parliament. They will argue that you are an absentee ruler. They will move to place the estate under Crown administration. You could lose everything." "I have already lost everything that matters. I lost it 2 years ago in a study where I told my wife she could have everything except love. I lost it every morning I walked past her without speaking. I lost it every evening I ate alone while she rebuilt an estate I was too arrogant to manage. Harwick cannot take anything from me that I have not already thrown away." He turned from the window and looked at her. "But he can take what you built. And that is the one thing I will not allow." Something shifted in Seraphina's expression. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But the faintest structural adjustment, like the first movement of ice at the edge of a frozen river when the current beneath it begins to change. "What are you going to do?" she asked again, and this time the question carried something different in its weight. Not skepticism, genuine uncertainty, the guarded willingness to hear an answer she had stopped expecting. I'm going to walk down to that gate, Caedric said. I'm going to invite Harwick's men into this house. I am going to sit them at the dining table and give them every document they request. And then I am going to tell them the truth. What truth? That my wife is the most competent administrator in the northern counties. That every reform they are investigating was designed and executed by her. That the estate's prosperity is entirely her achievement. And that if Harwick wants to argue that Ravenshire should be governed by its most capable leader, then I agree with him, because the most capable leader is already here. She has been here for 2 years, and the only person too stupid to recognize it was me. The silence that followed filled the room like pressure equalizing inside a sealed chamber. Seraphina stared at him. Her lips parted slightly, and for a moment, a fraction of a second that Caedric would remember for the rest of his life, her composure broke. Not into tears, not into softness, into something rawer. A flash of the woman behind the discipline, the woman who had spent 27 months building an empire inside the ruins of her own loneliness and had never once been told that the empire was real. She recovered almost instantly, but the crack had been visible, and they both knew it. That is either the bravest thing you have ever done, she said quietly, or the most reckless. At this point, I am not sure there is a difference. Caedric walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the handle and looked back at her. Come with me, he said, not as my wife, not as the Duchess, as the person who actually runs this estate. Let them see what Harwick is really trying to steal. Seraphina stood still for 3 heartbeats. Then she pulled her shoulders back, straightened the cuffs of her sleeves, and walked toward him. They descended the staircase side by side, not as husband and wife. Not yet. As something stranger and more fragile and infinitely more dangerous. 2 people walking into a battle neither of them was certain they could win, carrying nothing except the truth and the raw, unfinished, terrifying possibility that the truth might be enough. The front doors of Ravenshire Castle opened. Harwick's 4 men dismounted in the courtyard, and 300 miles south, in a London office overlooking the Thames, Lord Ashton opened a letter bearing the Ravenshire seal and read a fabricated accusation against Lord Adrian Mortimer, and reached for a pen to authorize the formal inquiry that would, within 72 hours, bring the full weight of the Ministry of Lands crashing down on the very estate the Duke was now attempting to save. The retraction letter sat on a silver tray in Caedric's study, unsent. The Morning Post had already been collected. Without it, Harwick's men sat at the dining table like surgeons preparing to open a body they already knew was dead. There were 4 of them. A solicitor named Graves, thin and precise, with the permanent expression of a man who had learned to enjoy the discomfort of others. 2 junior clerks who functioned as scribes, their pens already moving before anyone spoke. And a man named Pemberton, Harwick's personal political advisor, who carried himself with the relaxed authority of someone who had dismantled careers before breakfast and expected to dismantle another before lunch. Pemberton placed his leather case on the table and withdrew a sheaf of documents bound in red ribbon. "Your Grace," he said, addressing Caedric with a courtesy so polished it functioned as contempt, "Lord Harwick appreciates your willingness to cooperate with the committee's inquiry. We will endeavor to make this as efficient as possible." "I have no doubt," Caedric said. He sat at the head of the table. Seraphina sat to his right. The positioning was deliberate. Not behind him, not opposite him. Beside him, close enough that their presence at the table read as a unified front, which was precisely the image Harwick's delegation had been told would not exist. Pemberton noticed. His eyes moved between them with the quick assessment of a man recalculating assumptions. "We have been provided with documentation suggesting significant irregularities in the management of Ravenshire's tenant agreements and financial operations," Pemberton began. "Specifically, that estate governance has been conducted outside traditional ducal authority, creating a de facto independent administration operating without oversight." "There is nothing de facto about it," Caedric said. Pemberton paused. "I beg your pardon?" "The Duchess has managed the estate's internal operations for the past 2 years. She restructured the tenant agreements, negotiated the merchant contracts, reorganized the agricultural strategy, and administered the financial systems that have made Ravenshire the most productive territory in the northern counties. This was not an accident. It was not an irregularity. It was a decision. A decision made by whom? By me. The lie was clean and total. Caedric delivered it without hesitation, without the micro-expressions that betray fabrication, because in the moment he said it, he realized it was not entirely a lie. He had told Blackwood to let her do what she wanted. He had stepped aside. He had created the vacuum that Seraphina filled. The architecture of his negligence had become, in retrospect, the architecture of delegation. And if framing it that way was intellectually dishonest, it was also the only framing that would protect what she had built. Seraphina looked at him. He felt her gaze on the side of his face, but did not turn. If he turned, she would see the full scope of what he was doing, absorbing the narrative of failure into himself, redirecting Harwick's attack from her competence to his authority, making himself the target so that the work itself remained untouchable. And if she saw it too clearly, she might object. She might insist on honesty, on the accurate version where she had operated independently, because he had been too blind and too broken to participate. He could not let her do that, not because honesty was wrong, because Harwick's strategy depended on separation. On proving that the Duke and Duchess operated as disconnected entities, which meant the estate lacked unified governance, which meant parliamentary intervention was justified. The only counter was the appearance of a functioning partnership. Even if building that appearance required Caedric to claim credit for decisions he had been too negligent to make and too arrogant to acknowledge. He was protecting her work by lying about his own involvement in it. The irony was so precise, it felt surgical. "You are telling this committee," Pemberton said slowly, "that the Duchess's reforms were conducted under your direct authorization. I am telling you that the Duchess and I manage different aspects of a single estate. She oversees internal operations. I oversee external affairs. This is not irregular. It is efficient. And yet the documentation we have received suggests no communication between these two spheres of management, no joint directives, no coordinated strategy, no evidence of shared decision-making. Then your documentation is incomplete." Pemberton leaned back. His expression had changed. The relaxed superiority was still there, but beneath it, a new element had appeared: wariness. The cautious recalibration of a man who had arrived expecting to find a fractured household and was instead encountering a duke who appeared, against all intelligence, to be in full command. "We will need to review the original records," Pemberton said. "You will have them," Seraphina said. Every head turned toward her. She sat perfectly straight, her hands folded on the table, her voice carrying the same quiet authority Caedric had heard her use with merchants and estate officials and stubborn stewards for 2 years. The voice of a woman who understood power not as a performance, but as a function. Every ledger, every contract, every tenant agreement, every piece of correspondence related to estate operations for the past 26 months, she continued. "I will have them assembled in the estate office by morning. You may review them at your leisure. You may copy anything you wish. And when you have finished, you will find that Ravenshire's internal finances are more transparent, more detailed, and more rigorously documented than any estate in this kingdom. Because I built the system, and I built it to be examined." Pemberton studied her for a long moment. "That is generous, Your Grace." "It is not generous. It is strategic. You came here expecting to find dysfunction. You will find the opposite. And when your report reaches the committee, it will demonstrate that Lord Harwick's allegations were based on information provided by a disgruntled steward who was selling estate secrets to a political rival while collecting a salary from the house he was betraying." The temperature in the dining room dropped several degrees. Pemberton's expression went very still. Graves, the solicitor, stopped writing. The two clerks looked at each other with the panicked eye contact of men who have just realized they are in a room where the rules have changed. "I am not aware of any allegations regarding Mr. Blackwood's conduct," Pemberton said carefully. "You are now," Caedric said. "Thomas Blackwood has been copying estate financial records and transmitting them to Lord Harwick for approximately 9 months. He confessed to this in the presence of myself and the Duchess earlier today. The copies he provided are the documentation you are now presenting as evidence of mismanagement. Your entire inquiry is built on stolen materials supplied by a man who is being paid by your employer to betray his position." Silence. Caedric watched Pemberton process the information. He watched the political advisor's mind work through the implications with visible speed, calculating damage, assessing exposure, measuring the distance between the position Harwick had constructed and the legal catastrophe that would follow if the foundation of that position was provably corrupt. "These are serious allegations," Pemberton said. "They are not allegations. They are facts. And if Lord Harwick wishes to proceed with this inquiry, he is welcome to do so. But he will proceed knowing that the Duke of Ravenshire will present Blackwood's confession to the full committee, along with evidence that Harwick solicited the theft of private estate documents through financial inducement. The committee can then decide whether to investigate Ravenshire's management or Lord Harwick's methods." The room held its breath. Pemberton stood. He gathered his documents with the careful movements of a man handling something that had just become radioactive. "We will convey your position to Lord Harwick," he said. "Please do." Harwick's delegation left Ravenshire Castle within the hour. Their horses' hooves on the frozen courtyard sounded like a retreat, which is exactly what it was. Caedric stood at the study window and watched them ride through the gate. His hands were shaking again. Not from fear this time. From the chemical aftermath of sustained confrontation, the adrenaline dump that follows a battle fought with words instead of weapons, which is in many ways more exhausting because the body prepares for violence it never gets to release. Seraphina appeared in the doorway behind him. "The retraction letter," she said. "It never went out." He turned. The look on her face told him she already knew the answer. "No," he said. "The Morning Post was collected before I placed it on the tray. The original accusation is in London. Lord Ashton has it by now." "Then Adrian will face an inquiry." "Yes." "Based on a lie you told?" "Yes." Seraphina crossed her arms. The gesture was not defensive. It was structural, the posture of a woman holding herself together while deciding what shape to take next. "You just saved this estate from Harwick," she said. "You stood in that room and fought for everything I built. And I am trying to reconcile that with the man who fabricated a government complaint against an innocent person out of jealousy. I am trying to hold both of those things in my head at the same time, and they do not fit. They are not supposed to fit. They are both true. That is not good enough." "I know. Knowing is not the same as fixing." "I know that too." Seraphina exhaled. The sound carried the weight of months of accumulated endurance, the slow, grinding erosion of living inside a marriage that had been, until 72 hours ago, functionally indistinguishable from solitary confinement. "You need to go to London," she said, "in person. Not a letter. Not a courier. You need to stand in Lord Ashton's office and tell him the truth. All of it. That you fabricated the complaint, that Adrian did nothing wrong, that the entire thing was a personal vendetta dressed up as institutional concern. If I do that, I will be censured, possibly sanctioned. The political cost will be severe. The political cost of not doing it will be worse, because I will know you chose your reputation over a man's career, and that is a thing I cannot live beside." Caedric looked at her. The candlelight from the desk lamp caught the violet edge of her dark blue eyes, the color he had only recently learned to see, and he understood with the exhausted clarity that comes after days of crisis that this woman had been the center of gravity in his life for over 2 years, and he had orbited her without knowing it. Every decision he had made since her arrival, the dismissal, the negligence, the jealousy, the fabrication, the confrontation with Harwick, all of it had been shaped by her presence the way tides are shaped by a moon they cannot touch. He had spent his life believing that strength meant needing nothing, that the most powerful position a man could occupy was the one where no person, no emotion, no connection had leverage over him. His father had built that belief into the architecture of his character, the way engineers build load-bearing walls into buildings, and Caedric had maintained those walls with religious discipline for 3 decades. But load-bearing walls serve a purpose only when the building they support is worth preserving. And the building Caedric had constructed, the cold, efficient, emotionally vacant structure of his public life, was not a building anyone would choose to live inside. Seraphina had proven that by building something better within its shadow, something warmer, something that fed people and educated children and kept families alive through winters, something real. The walls had to come down, not because they were weak, because they were preventing anything valuable from growing inside them. "I will go to London tomorrow," he said. "Tonight." Seraphina. Tonight, Caedric. Every hour you wait is an hour that accusation sits on Ashton's desk looking legitimate. Adrian does not deserve a single additional hour of that. He held her gaze. The woman looking back at him was not the trembling bride who had stood at the altar 27 months ago. She was not the silent figure he had walked past in corridors without acknowledgement. She was the person who had rebuilt his estate from the inside, who had saved his legacy from Harwick's assault, and who was now standing in his study demanding that he do the hardest thing he had ever done, not for political advantage, not for self-preservation, but because it was right. And the fact that she still cared enough to demand it, after everything he had done to make caring impossible, was either the most generous thing he had ever witnessed or the most devastating. Because it meant she had not given up on him, and that meant he was responsible for becoming someone who deserved that faith. The weight of that responsibility settled onto his shoulders like armor made of something heavier than iron. Heavier because it could not be removed. Heavier because wearing it required not strength but honesty. And honesty had always been the one burden Duke of Ravenshire could not carry. He carried it anyway. He rode to London through the night. The roads were frozen solid, and Sovereign's hooves struck the packed earth with a rhythm that sounded like a clock counting down to something irrevocable. Caedric rode without stopping, without eating, without sleep. The cold tore through his coat and settled into his muscles until his hands were numb on the reins, and his face felt like something carved from the same ice that lined the roadside ditches. He arrived at Lord Ashton's residence at 7 in the morning, mud-splattered and half-frozen, looking nothing like a duke, and everything like a man who had ridden 90 miles to undo a mistake before it became permanent. Ashton received him in a private study. The minister was a careful man, deliberate in speech and conservative in judgment, and the sight of the Duke of Ravenshire standing in his doorway at dawn, haggard and road-worn, produced an expression of genuine concern. Ravenshire? What in the name of sanity has happened? I need to retract a complaint I submitted regarding Lord Adrian Mortimer. The survey inspector? I read the letter yesterday. I was preparing to authorize an inquiry. Do not authorize it. The complaint is false. Ashton set down his pen. He looked at Caedric with the particular attention of a man who has spent 30 years in government service and has learned that the most dangerous statements are the ones delivered with complete composure. False, he repeated. Fabricated. Lord Mortimer accessed nothing beyond standard survey materials voluntarily provided by the Duchess of Ravenshire. His conduct was entirely professional. The complaint was motivated by personal grievance, not institutional concern. Personal grievance. My wife and Lord Mortimer developed a professional rapport during his survey of our estate. I perceived it as a threat. I used your office to punish a man who had done nothing wrong because I was incapable of addressing my own failure as a husband through honest means. The silence that followed was the kind that exists inside courtrooms after a verdict is read. Heavy. Final. Filled with the sound of a career restructuring itself around new information. Do you understand what you are telling me? Ashton said quietly. I understand that I am confessing to the misuse of ministerial channels for personal purposes. I understand that this will result in formal censure and possible sanctions. I understand that my political standing will be damaged, possibly beyond repair. And I am telling you anyway, because Lord Mortimer does not deserve to have his career destroyed by a lie, and I do not deserve to have mine preserved by one. Ashton studied him for a long time. I will need this in writing. I will draft it now, if you will provide paper. Ashton provided paper. Caedric sat at the minister's desk and wrote his confession in longhand, every sentence deliberate, every word chosen to leave no ambiguity about the scope of his failure. When he finished, he signed it with the steady hand of a man who has accepted that the signature will cost him everything and has decided that the cost is the point. He rode back to Ravenshire the following day. The return journey took longer. The roads had thawed slightly, turning to mud that sucked at Sovereign's hooves and slowed their progress to a grinding walk in several stretches. Caedric did not push the horse. He rode slowly through a landscape that was shifting imperceptibly from winter to something not yet spring, the trees still bare but the sky carrying a different quality of light, paler, longer, hinting at a warmth that had not arrived but could be felt approaching. He reached the estate at dusk. The castle rose against the darkening sky like something out of a different century, which it was, massive and ancient and built by men who believed that permanence was achieved through stone and intimidation. Caedric looked at it from the road and saw, for the first time, not a fortress, but a shell. A magnificent, imposing, architecturally perfect shell, constructed around a hollow center that had never been filled with anything worth protecting. Until Seraphina. He dismounted in the courtyard. A groom took Sovereign. Caedric stood in the cold air and looked up at the windows of the estate office, where a single lamp burned against the gathering dark. He found her there, seated behind the desk, reviewing the financial documents she had organized for Harwick's delegation. Her hair was loose, which he had never seen before, falling past her shoulders in dark waves that caught the lamplight and held it. She looked up when he entered. "It is done," he said. "Ashton has my written confession. The inquiry against Adrian will not proceed. The minister will likely issue a formal censure within the month. What will that mean for you? Loss of my seat on the Trade Committee, suspension from the Privy Council Advisory Panel, public embarrassment, private satisfaction from several political rivals who have been waiting for me to make a mistake this large. And you did it anyway. You told me to. I told you to because it was right. You did it because you chose to. Those are different things." He stood in the doorway and looked at her, and something that had been locked inside his chest for 2 years, maybe longer, maybe his entire life, shifted. Not broke, not opened. Shifted. Like a foundation settling into new ground, finding a position it had not occupied before, one that could bear weight differently. "I do not know how to be the man you need," he said. "I was not built for it. Everything I was taught, everything I practiced, everything I became was designed to prevent me from needing anyone. And I am standing here needing you, and I have no skill for it. I have no training. I have no experience. I only have the knowledge that the life I built without you in it was not a life. It was an administration." Seraphina rose from the desk. She walked toward him slowly, and each step closed a distance that was not measured in feet, but in months, in silence. In all the mornings he had walked past her, and all the evenings she had eaten alone, and all the nights they had spent on opposite sides of a castle that was large enough to contain an entire world, and too small to hold the emptiness between them. She stopped 3 feet from him. "I am not going to save you," she said. "I need you to understand that. I am not your redemption. I am not a reward for finally behaving like a decent human being. If we rebuild this, it will be because you do the work. Every day. Not because you rode to London once and told the truth." "I understand. You say that, but understanding is easy. Living it is the part that breaks people." "Then let it break me. I have spent 31 years being unbreakable, and it cost me everything worth having. Let it break me. I would rather be broken and present than intact and alone." Seraphina looked at him. Her eyes, dark blue, almost violet in the lamplight, moved across his face the way they had moved across estate ledgers and tenant reports for 2 years, reading the data, assessing the structure, determining whether the foundation could support what was being asked to stand on it. Then she reached out and placed her hand against his chest, not on his shoulder, not on his arm. Against his chest, where his heart was hammering with a violence he could not conceal, where the entire fragile machinery of his emotional life was exposed to her palm like a wound offered for examination. He closed his eyes. The sensation of her hand against him was so foreign, so entirely outside the catalog of experiences his body had been trained to process, that his nervous system did not know how to categorize it. It was not pleasure. It was not pain. It was presence. The physical reality of another person choosing to touch you, not out of obligation or ceremony, but out of the deliberate, voluntary decision to close a distance they had every right to maintain. "Your heart is racing," she said. "I know." "Are you frightened?" "More than I have ever been in my life." She did not remove her hand. She held it there, steady against the chaos beneath his ribs, and the steadiness of it, the calm, unshaking pressure of her palm against the place where he was most vulnerable, began to do something to the rhythm of his pulse. Not slow it, organize it, give it a pattern to follow that was not panic. "Then we start here," she said quietly. Not with promises, not with speeches. Here, with you being frightened and telling me instead of building a fortress around it. He opened his eyes. She was looking up at him, and in her expression, he saw something he would spend years learning to deserve. Not love, not yet. Something that preceded love, the way foundation precedes architecture. Trust, conditional, cautious, hard-won trust, offered not as a gift but as a loan, with the understanding that the terms would be renegotiated daily and the collateral was everything he was. He placed his hand over hers. They stood like that in the lamplight while the castle settled into evening around them, while the courtyard emptied and the sky darkened and the first stars appeared above the frozen grounds of an estate that had been built on stone and power and the absolute certainty that those things were enough. They were not enough. They had never been enough. And the man who finally understood that stood in an office with his wife's hand against his heart and felt, for the first time in his conscious memory, the terrifying, annihilating, ungovernable relief of being known. Spring came slowly to Ravenshire. The ice retreated in stages reluctantly, as though winter itself was not convinced the season had earned the right to change. But change it did. Green pushed through frozen ground. Water ran where ice had stood. The tenant fields turned from white to brown to the first fragile green of new planting, and the estate moved with the careful optimism of a place that has survived something difficult and is not yet certain the difficulty is over. Caedric received his censure from the ministry in March. It was public, humiliating, and precisely what he deserved. He accepted it without protest, without legal maneuvering, without the political counteroffensive that every advisor in his circle urged him to mount. He stood before the committee and confirmed every detail of his confession and walked out of the chamber stripped of 2 committee seats and the advisory role his father had spent a career acquiring. He walked out lighter than he had walked in. Adrian Mortimer sent a letter to Ravenshire in April. It was addressed to Seraphina and consisted of a single paragraph thanking her for the estate's cooperation with his survey and noting that his final report had been submitted to the ministry with the highest possible commendation. He did not mention the retracted accusation. He did not mention Caedric. The letter was professional, gracious, and carried beneath its courtesy the quiet dignity of a man who understood exactly what had happened and had chosen not to weaponize it. Seraphina read the letter in the estate office. Caedric sat across from her, reviewing a tenant petition, and watched her read it. When she finished, she folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. "He is a good man," she said. "Yes," Caedric said. "He is." The words cost him something, but the cost was manageable now. Not because the jealousy had disappeared, it had not. It lived inside him the way all primitive emotions live inside civilized men, caged but alert, pacing behind bars that required daily maintenance. But the cage held, and maintaining it had become less an act of discipline and more an act of choice, the conscious, daily, exhausting decision to respond to fear with honesty instead of aggression. It was the hardest thing he had ever done, harder than parliamentary politics, harder than managing an estate, harder than riding 90 miles through frozen darkness to confess a failure that would cost him everything he had spent a decade building, because it never ended. There was no single dramatic moment after which the work was done. There was only the next morning, and the next, and the next, and in each one the same choice, to be present or to retreat, to speak or to withhold, to reach across the distance or to let it calcify back into stone. Some mornings he failed. Some mornings the old architecture reasserted itself, and he retreated into silence, and Seraphina would look at him across the breakfast table with an expression that was not anger but measurement, gauging whether the retreat was temporary or structural, whether the foundation was settling or cracking. On those mornings, he learned to say the hardest sentence in any language. "I am struggling today." 3 words that would have been inconceivable 6 months ago. 3 words that cost more than any political concession he had ever made. 3 words that, spoken aloud to the woman sitting across from him, prevented the silence from hardening into permanence. They rebuilt the marriage the way Seraphina had rebuilt the estate. Not through grand gestures, through daily labor, through the accumulated weight of small decisions made consistently over time. Breakfast together, evenings in the same room, Conversations that began with logistics and gradually, cautiously, began to include the personal. His childhood, her grief for Arabella, his fear of inadequacy, her anger at being unseen, the tender, dangerous archaeology of two people excavating each other's histories and trying not to damage what they found. Summer arrived. The estate flourished. The northern villages reported their strongest harvest in a decade. The schoolhouse enrolled 32 children. Martha Gowan's husband was working again, walking with a limp, but walking, and their infant had grown into a toddler who screamed with delight whenever the Duchess's carriage appeared on the village road. Caedric rode with her now. Not every time, but often enough that the tenants began to associate the Duke's face with the Duchess's visits, which was itself a quiet revolution inside a community that had learned to fear the Ravenshire name long before it learned to trust the Ravenshire presence. On a warm evening in late July, Caedric and Seraphina walked the grounds together after dinner. The gardens were in full bloom, and the air carried the heavy sweetness of jasmine and cut grass and the particular quality of English summer twilight that makes everything look like it was painted by someone who believed the world was, despite all evidence, worth preserving. They walked without speaking for a while. The silence between them was different now, not the suffocating void of two strangers sharing a corridor. Something more like the quiet between two musicians who have learned each other's rhythms well enough to rest between phrases without losing the melody. Seraphina stopped beside a stone bench overlooking the valley. The sun was setting behind the western ridge, and the light turned the landscape gold. "I need to tell you something," she said. Caedric stopped beside her. His pulse quickened, and he noticed it quicken, and he let it quicken without trying to control it. The noticing and the letting were themselves victories, small and invisible, and worth more than any political triumph he had ever achieved. "Tell me," he said. "I forgive you." 3 words, delivered without ceremony, without dramatic music or golden light or the theatrical weight that forgiveness carries in stories told by people who have never had to grant it. Just a woman standing beside a man in a garden, saying 3 words that she had earned the right to withhold for as long as she wanted. Caedric stood very still. "You do not have to," he said. "I know. That is why it means something." He turned to face her. The setting sun caught her eyes and turned them violet. The color he had spent 2 years not seeing, the color he now noticed every single day with a specificity that bordered on devotion. "I will spend the rest of my life earning that," he said. "You will spend the rest of your life trying," she corrected. "Earning is never finished. It is just the trying that does not stop." He reached for her hand. She let him take it. Her fingers were warm from the summer air, and they closed around his with a pressure that was firm and deliberate, the grip of a woman who had decided to hold on and was not going to pretend the decision was easy. They stood at the edge of the garden and watched the sun set over the valley, over the tenant farms and the village rooftops and the winding roads that connected Ravenshire to the rest of the kingdom, and the light faded slowly, the way difficult things become bearable, not all at once, but gradually, degree by degree, until the darkness that remains is no longer darkness at all, but simply the ordinary, livable, imperfect night that follows every day. Caedric Ravenshire did not become a good man that summer. Good was a destination he would spend years approaching and never fully reach. What he became was something more useful and more honest. He became a man capable of sitting with his own inadequacy without converting it into cruelty. A man who understood that the strongest foundation is not stone or iron or the accumulated weight of ancestral authority, but the daily, unglamorous, terrifying decision to let another person see you clearly and to keep standing after they do. The kingdom never told stories about that kind of strength. The kingdom told stories about conquerors and warriors and men who bent the world to their will through force and dominance. Those stories were easier. Those stories had clean lines and clear heroes and satisfying endings where power was its own reward. But inside Ravenshire Castle, in a study where a man and a woman now worked side by side at the same desk, a different kind of story was being written. One without triumph, without conquest, without the comfortable certainty that the hard part was over. Only the quiet, relentless, impossibly difficult work of two people choosing each other again and again, in the full knowledge of everything that choice would cost. And that, in the end, was the only story worth telling.